It's really a privilege to have you on board. And our prayer is that we will have a meaningful time together. I want to thank Professor Robert Meagher and Dr. Willem Boshoff and Anelia Heese, who are taking part in the program this afternoon. And then let me just say, as chairperson or program director / facilitator this afternoon, we invited Dr. Wilhelm Verwoerd. And Wilhelm is a senior researcher at the University of Stellenbosch in the field of studies in historical trauma. And Wilhelm is a widely experienced peace facilitator, especially in Northern Ireland, where he spent 12 years. And it's a privilege for us to welcome Wilhelm, as he has done really valuable work for our Synod in the recent years in terms of discipleship, prayer, reconciliation, and the promotion of peace. So Wilhelm is a trusted friend and colleague to us in the Dutch Reformed Church. So I'm going to hand over to Wilhelm, and then Wilhelm will take us further and introduce the speakers and run the program for us. Wilhelm.
Well, thank you very much, Dani, and hello everybody. It's something that we've talked about for years, and obviously I've come, 15 years now on a journey with Robert, and more years than that working with people in other conflict areas around people who were involved in conflict, trying to find meaning in that involvement. And so for us now to be able to take a step and say, can we, within our context, and specifically within the Dutch Reformed Church context, with people from an Afrikaner background, and with everything that we went through during the pre-94 era, can we find language to make sense of deeply make sense, find meaning? And I am very excited that we have a dear friend and a very experienced colleague, Professor Robert Meagher, to join us. And the hope is that from Robert's experience in working especially with veterans in the American context, and finding through his immersion in the classics as a scholar, but as a facilitator, as a carer also for family and friends and community members who've been involved in the Vietnam War and then also in the other more recent wars, that some of that experience and the language that Robert has developed over time, that can help us to perhaps find some meaning in our context. To hold up a mirror, we're not suggesting that the American context and the American language is going to be directly applicable to our context, but we're using it as a mirror, as an invitation for us to look for our own localized sense of meaning. And we are grateful that Dr. Willem Boshoff has joined us, a long experience working pastorally within the Dutch Reformed Church, and himself a chaplain during the late 80s within the SADF. And then very importantly, we have Anelia Heese with us. You've just heard a quick introduction before we started, but I think what's so critical and why we invited Anelia is that we find that there's a younger generation, the children of many people in this room, my children, represented, as it were, by Anelia, who are trying to understand what their parents' generation went through, and are also for themselves trying to find meaning in what is being transmitted across generations. So we're really hoping that this would be this kind of exploratory, non-judgmental space where together we can go into this deep water and hopefully find some things that can help us to swim together in more meaningful ways. I think the purpose is specifically to focus on the role of chaplains or ministers within the Dutch Reformed Church. And we know that there are many people out there who have a lot of direct experience of our conflict. We need to create more opportunities. We know that there's crucial voices that we still need to listen to. But in this case, we're focusing on people coming from a sort of chaplaincy experience with a church connection, and we're focusing on the next generation's response to some of that. And we're drawing on the limitations of Zoom, but also the beauty that we can have somebody from the eastern coast of America, Anelia from Berlin, and all of us scattered all across South Africa, that we can be together in this space this afternoon. So thank you everybody who has joined us. Thank you for being willing to be part of this conversation. And Robert, Bob, we just want to, for the first part of our afternoon, give you time to share some of your hard-won experience with us in the way that you do. We'll then take a short break, as you see in the program. Then we'll ask Willem and Anelia to give an initial response from your point of view. And then we will again just have a short break so that we don't become too tired with Zoom. And then after that, we will have at least an hour for us as a group to go into conversation and response and working together with whatever has come up for us during this time. We'll do it in a small group space, like just after the break, and then we'll come back into the large group space. Thank you, Dani, also for all the important behind the scenes organizing and for hosting this. It's encouraging for me also that the church is taking the lead through your role within the church. Okay, Robert, I mean, over to you. We look forward to listening to what you have to share.
Thank you, Wilhelm. And thank you very personally, Wilhelm, for how crucial you have been in my own development and learning and introducing me to the veterans of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And it helped me to realize how there are no borders to moral injury and to the work being done to heal the wounds of war, which go on last painfully for generations. So it's a great privilege to be here with all of you this afternoon. And in the time allotted to me, I want to touch briefly on three topics. First, when and why I first entered the valley of darkness known as moral injury, and where that road led me, and what I have come to understand about moral injury, its causes, and its treatment. I have to apologize for writing out my remarks in advance. I wanted to be as brief, as concise, as clear and focused as I could be, and I think writing them down will, has helped me to do that. So I apologize for the lack of spontaneity that writing things down does inevitably detract from. As a child born during World War II, the Good War, as it's been called, I grew up in a working-class Chicago neighborhood brimful with combat veterans, war refugees, and the most concentrated population of Holocaust survivors in North America. Day in, day out, I witnessed, in the eyes of relatives, neighbors, and families I was close to, the painful truth of H.C. Palmer's poem, After War, a 6-word story. I'm home alive. Well, not really. In my experience, the invisible wounds of my parents' reputedly silent generation were far from hidden or silent. My most vivid war-related childhood memory was of an incident when my 6-year-old friends and I were playing war, armed and outfitted from a local war surplus store, quarreling over who was dead and who wasn't. Our war game was cut short when my childhood hero, a decorated Army Ranger, no more than 21 or 22, screamed at us. He said he had something important to teach us. We sat down on the sidewalk around him as he told us what real war was like, what he had done in the war. In his case, killing kids a few years younger than himself, silently with a knife. After a few minutes, he began shaking, then sobbing, until he collapsed and his young pregnant wife came out to take him inside, wrapped in her arms. But not before he had made all of us, one at a time, promise to never go to war. So far as I know, none of us ever did. I say that not proudly, but gratefully. I eluded conscription myself in the 1960s, since when my draft number came up, I was living under religious vows in a Catholic religious community, where I remained for 9 years. My brother was not so fortunate. Conscripted in his mid-20s, he found himself on a chartered Pan Am flight to Saigon to serve his country as an infantry soldier with the 1st Cavalry in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. As was the case with so many of his fellow veterans, he came home alive, but not really. He was not the same in so many ways. While the flight time from Saigon to the United States was 17 hours, his true homecoming took years, decades in fact, and called for more courage, faith, and endurance than anything he had faced in his war. I understood none of this. All I knew was the sense that I had lost a brother to the war. In search of understanding, I pored through post-war congressional records, Vietnam veterans' testimonies, and memoirs. My brother was silent. His war sealed tight within him, but more and more veterans started to tell their stories. I listened as my only way to learn, my only way to help. Like any civilian innocent of war, I was told that if you didn't go, you didn't know, something I had already found out. I imagined and hoped, however, that if I were to listen long enough and hard enough, I might understand something and might be able to offer some support. My engagement with veterans intensified in 2004 when the first wave of combat veterans from the Iraq War began to return home. It was all too clear that the country was not remotely prepared to address their needs, physical, psychological, or spiritual. Admittedly, their welcome was not hostile or condemning as it had been for so many Vietnam vets. Instead, it was indifferent. Their homecomings represented on the national level a non-event, except for the veterans themselves, of course, their families, and their federal caregivers in an understaffed, underfunded, antiquated VA, Veterans Administration, that hadn't confronted waves of fresh combat veterans for several decades. For my part, I began to work with a number of veterans groups, most closely with an inspiring organization called the Veterans Education Project, whose aim was twofold: to educate young people on the realities of war and to heal themselves by telling their stories, a process my close friend of over 30 years, Jonathan Shea, has called communalization. Dr. Shea, as you likely know, is the pioneering Boston VA psychiatrist who brought new understanding and gave a new name, moral injury, to the wounds driving thousands of veterans and active duty military to take their own lives. Suicides in both groups far exceed the U.S. combatant lives lost in any of our contemporary wars, with no sign yet of diminishing. Moral injury, like taxes, is unavoidable, part of war's inevitable price tag. What's more, it is apparently contagious across generations. We would know this more clearly if an accurate count were kept of the suicides and painful human wreckage among combatants' spouses and children and grandchildren. The dark truth is that when the guns grow silent, warriors bring their war home with them. I know, confessed Iraq War veteran and poet Brian Turner. I know, he writes, that when I leave the tent, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of dead people will begin leaving the tent and following us home. And the wounded, and the maimed, and the traumatized, and the frightened, and the shattered, and the shivering, and the bruised, and the broken. The ruined world will call its home inside of me, and all of them will follow us to our planes and board with us. They'll walk through the streets of America, through my hometown, standing in my backyard late at night, sometimes sitting at the foot of the bed to witness my wife and me curled up in a dream. Sadly, in our age of forever war, the victims of war, combatant and non-combatant, have multiplied year after year and by now are numberless. In warlike nations like my own, armed to the teeth, bristling with nuclear weapons, the moral injury of war is arguably endemic. We are all veterans. The word comes from the Latin vedus, meaning aged, old, literally old, or just old before one's time, experienced beyond one's years, worn out. We are all suffering moral injury. War, domestic or foreign, mortgages the future. It is a debt that across time must be paid off with interest, compounded daily, until not only peace but reconciliation and justice are achieved, if they ever are. Summing up his own war in his own country, Brian Turner confessed that, I quote, "America, vast and laid out from one ocean to another, is not a large enough space to contain the war each warrior brings home. And even if it could, it doesn't want to." After all the conflict and division that South Africa has been through, perhaps something of the same might be said of your country, which I suspect is why we are gathering together today in this conversation. Decades before COVID-19, moral injury was already a lethal plague in our midst. Albert Camus, until his death in 1960, warned us of a devastating moral pestilence, placing not only our lives, but our humanity in grave peril. Mankind, he stated in a 1948 interview, mankind has probably been given its last chance. Yes, he went on to explain, there is a human crisis, because in today's world, we can contemplate the death or the torture of a human being with a feeling of indifference, friendly concern, scientific interest, or simple passivity. It is no less true of our generation than of his that, in his words, the years we have lived through have killed something in us. And that something is simply the old confidence that humanity had in itself, which led us to believe that we could always elicit human reactions from each other if we spoke in the language of a common humanity. The language of a common humanity. How naive and simplistic that sounds to so many in our world today. No longer our first language, it is an all but lost tongue in most places. What, we may ask, does it even mean? In South Africa, unlike the United States, there is at least the homegrown African tradition of Ubuntu, a precious humanistic legacy and natural resource, however tattered and endangered it may be at this point. I have so far used the term moral injury without yet explaining what I mean. So what is it? The first thing that needs to be said and made clear is that moral injury is not PTSD, and that moral injury is the far deeper, more devastating, more intractable wound of the two, although they frequently accompany and reinforce each other. Although I was not armed with the term moral injury until I first read and met Jonathan Shea, I was convinced very early that PTSD was a coat that simply did not fit the men I was listening to. On some level, I knew this very early. When, at the age of 6, I sat and watched my grown-up war hero unravel on the pavement beside me. Later, the Vietnam veterans I came to know well convinced me of this. I remember the rage of one of them when he told me that his VA, his Veterans Administration psychiatrist, just didn't get it. Although he had endured heartbreaking loss, blind terror, and serious wounds, what still haunted him, his therapist but every time he tried to bring up with his therapist what still haunted him, his therapist warned him that if he went any further, anything he said would be reported and could be used against him in a court of law. Now, I knew his story, and he was no war criminal. His point was that war itself is crime, and he had waged war. The men I listened to and came to know through Wilhelm in Northern Ireland, an assassin, a car bomber, a Royal Ulster constable, a British infantry officer, were all eloquent in their conviction that it was their soul that was wounded, and that as a consequence they lived in impenetrable darkness. These were their words. Their souls were dead or perishing. They had gone dark in life without going dark in death. Moral injury is a moral injury, not essentially a psychological injury, much less a neurological one. It is a wound to the conscience, and thus to our core identity. In The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin concludes that, quote, of all the differences between man and the lower animals, the moral sense or conscience is by far the most important, end of quote. Michael Tomasello of the Max Planck Institute concurs, arguing that, quote, it is our morality that defines us as a species. And Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker adds that, he writes, morality is close to our conception of the meaning of life. Moral goodness is what gives each of us the sense that we are worthy human beings. Martha Nussbaum has spoken eloquently of the fragility of goodness, and perhaps nowhere is goodness more fragile than in war. Lastly, Gitta Sereny, author of Into That Darkness, concludes that, she writes, if morality is extinguished, there is no human being left. Navy commander and Orthodox chaplain David Alexander has described the extreme extinction of humanity as a, in his words, transition from being obliged to kill to a feeling of excited anticipation towards killing. Echoing World War II veteran J. Glenn Gray's reflections on the critical difference between men who had killed and men who were killers. So what exactly do we mean by conscience? I suggest that we begin with the assertion of the first century Jewish philosopher Philo Judaeus to the effect that native and indwelling in every soul is a cross-examiner, he writes, which is our accuser and our judge. We may know this voice by different names, and it may say one thing to you and another to me, but I suspect that none or very few of us have never heard it. The experience of conscience, regardless of whose voice we believe it to be, and regardless of what it says to us, is a common one, and is aptly described in the generic word we use to designate it. Conscience, from the Latin words for with and knowledge, suggests shared rather than private idiosyncratic understanding, what in Greek is known as syneidesis, mutual awareness, communication, being as it were on the same page. Conscience is Janus-faced, looking both inward and outward, a mirror of the soul that at the same time reflects a community with which the soul is either in harmony or at odds. Conscience exposes us to the approval or disapproval of eyes and ears from which there is ultimately nowhere to hide, because to hide from our conscience is to hide from ourselves. The Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero once called conscience the theatrum virtuti, the theater of virtue, where our deeds are manifest, exposed to others, a stage without dark corners, with no opportunity for concealment. Even in what Cicero referred to as the animi conscientiae, the conscience of the soul, the court of innermost appeal, even here we find ourselves standing before a judge, a jury of our peers, or a mirror. For the Christian tradition, there is finally but one judge before whom we have no choice but to stand, Dominus Deus, the Lord God, whom Augustine in his Confessions addressed as Arbiter conscientiae meae, the arbiter of my conscience. Whether welcome or unwelcome, approaching or reproachful, approving or reproachful, the voice of conscience makes itself heard, warning us we are about to cross a line we oughtn't, rebuking us for already having done so, or rewarding us with peace of mind for having watched our step. It is the voice of caution, guilt, shame, and well-being. Conscience, I would suggest, is a compass. It helps us find our way. It keeps us on track, alerting us when we are about to go astray or when we are already lost. For most everyone, war is another world, an alien planet where we must reset our inner compass, recalibrate our conscience if we are to serve the cause that brought us there and survive. But what happens to us when our war ends and when we find that we have survived? Can we reset our compass again, return to the world we knew and find peace? Returning warriors inevitably put this question somewhere to someone, if only to themselves. It is enough to keep anyone up at night, and often does. For one, Michael Yandel, a former Army explosive ordnance specialist, says it allowed him very little sleep when he came home from war. He writes of his disillusionment, of the erosion of his sense of place in the world. He writes, "The spiritual and emotional foundations of the world disappeared and made it impossible for me to sleep the sleep of the just. What began to erode for me," he writes, "in Iraq in 2004 was my perception of good and evil. What I lost was a world that made moral sense. I was 19 when I left for war. I did not know I was leaving a world that made sense, a world where people respected one another's lives and dignity, a world where violence and murder were understood to be wrong and punished by laws, and entering a world where all bets were off." Yandel, now a minister in Greensboro, North Carolina, has come to understand and accept that while he can try to restore his moral compass to its peacetime settings, there is no turning back the clock and reversing time. He describes his moral injury as a chronic illness, something like the pain of arthritis, he explains, or an old bad knee that someone complains about when it rains. In this, he is one of the lucky ones. Unlike his less fortunate, more gravely wounded comrades in arms, who at an alarming rate find their pain insufferable and life itself a burden they can no longer bear. The truth is that the rules of war are not the rules of peace. War has always required a radical recalibration of conscience, of our shared understanding of good and evil, of right and wrong, the crossing of a line that something deep profoundly deep in us, warns us not to cross. War, after all, is a euphemism. As such, it is an evasion. War is about killing. The soldier, writes former Marine captain and Iraq War veteran Tyler Boudreau, the soldier, he writes, kills for a living. It is his reason for being. Killing is not a byproduct, he says. It's not a byproduct or some shitty collateral duty like peeling potatoes or scrubbing the latrine. It is the institutional point. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Pete Kilner made the same point year after year in his West Point class on the morality of killing, where he taught there is only one absolutely unique and defining characteristic of our profession, the profession of arms. We are organized, equipped, and trained to kill people. As company level leaders, he says, we recruit patriotic young Americans to kill, equip them to kill, train them to kill, and develop and issue orders for them to kill, issue fire commands for them to kill, and commend them for killing the enemies of our country. Even as part of a larger mission, says Kilner, killing is still the biggest moral decision one can make and the biggest moral taboo that one can break. World War II veteran and philosopher J. Glenn Gray, author of The Warriors, Reflections on Men in Battle, argues further that the guilt and violation involved in killing, rather than rooted in the moral order, that the taboos are metaphysical. To suffer from moral injury, a person must possess a living conscience, an active, ethical immune system, as it were, a personal code of honor. Moral injury, therefore, is both an indictment and an indication, a confirmation of character, even a character in ruins. In war, few of those suffering from moral injury are war criminals. They are men and women painfully shattered by the essential criminality of war. It is often the finest soldiers who suffer most from moral injury. Moral injury is a sign of strength, not weakness. The morally injured are not lacking in grit, resilience, courage, or commitment. They are broken, not defective, darkened, not demonic. They have done their duty as defined by the law of their land and sanctioned or even blessed in nearly every church by, and in all likelihood, their church. They have observed the code of military conduct and the rules of engagement laid out for them. None of this alters, however, the truth that they have violated their humanity. War makes us killers, wrote Marine Captain Timothy Kudo. We must confront, he says, this horror directly if we're honest about the true costs of war. I'm no longer, he says, the good person I once thought I was. There's nothing that can change that. It's impossible to forget what happened, and the only people who could forgive me are dead. We need to stop telling our warriors they have nothing to be ashamed of, urges Army Major and Orthodox priest Sean Levine. We need to stop telling our warriors they have nothing to be ashamed of and start listening to their shame, their guilt, their loss, their inner emptiness. After multiple combat deployments, Chaplain Devine speaks from experience when he asserts unequivocally that, he says, war hurts the human soul because war is evil. Killing in any circumstance, he explains, killing in any circumstance violates a deep moral sensibility situated in the human heart. And this heart alarm, he calls it, this heart alarm sounds because war and killing represent profound evils that fragment and dissipate the very core of the human person. For many veterans, what they have seen, what they have done, what they have been a part of, is too much to leave behind. Contrary to Freud's conviction that, in his words, modern men know better than to allow the past to haunt them, contrary to Freud, men and women are haunted by the lives they have taken, by the destruction they have wrought, by the violence they have brought down on others. To sense their pain, we need only to listen to Noah Pierce, who, after 2 deployments in Iraq, wrote these final words in 2007 before putting a gun to his head. Time's finally up. I am not a good person. I have done bad things. I have taken lives. Now it's time to take mine. My son, explained his grieving mother, my son couldn't forgive himself for some of the things he did. He thought of himself as a murderer and a bad person because he still had the urge to hurt people, to kill people. The United States Army turned my son into a killer. They trained him to kill to protect others. They forgot to untrain him, to take that urge to kill away from him. Noah Pierce's mother, in her grief and rage, uttered a dark truth that needs to be pondered. The Army turned her son into a killer, trained him to kill. They flipped the kill switch in her son, as they have learned to do so effectively. Some, like retired Army psychologist Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, have studied this training in critical depth, but most take it for granted as what happens, setting aside the realities of mixed-gender military, what happens when you set out to turn boys into men and civilians into warriors. Mrs. Pierce's darker assessment, however, is more to the point and may help explain why some enlistees take their lives during basic training, and many others trace their moral injury to their training and not to their first firefight. Stepping aside from the statistics, I can anecdotally report that a student of mine, who was also an active duty Army officer, told me how he himself, in basic training, had attempted suicide in his barracks and was stopped by a fellow trainee. Another of his fellows, however, had already completed the act, to which their drill sergeant commented, "Good riddance." What is seldom acknowledged and rarely noted, however, is the fact that many of those who train for combat and never put that training into practice nevertheless suffer from moral injury. And some of these innocents even take their own lives. A startling official Pentagon 2011 report on military suicide stated that roughly half of those who took their lives, half of the active duty military who took their lives, had no personal history of deployment in either Iraq or Afghanistan, and 85% had no direct combat history. What can this possibly mean? If moral injury represents a wound inflicted by personal involvement in war, by killing and destruction, what sense does it make for those who never took part nor ever witnessed it to suffer from moral injury, even to the extent that they take their own lives? I have only a tentative suggestion to offer here, one formed after talking with a number of active duty servicemen and women who have made this same claim. It may have to do with the kill switch that the military knows all too well how to turn on in its ranks. To be primed to kill, convinced of one's capacity and willingness to take life, and to have rehearsed the act until it is so ingrained as to become an autonomic response, may be, in some real if elusive way, to have already done the act, and to have become a killer with clean hands, but a blood-stained soul. This is precisely what a young woman whom I will call Sally has painfully reported. Deployed to Iraq, Sally was trained as a convoy driver and was conditioned to run over anyone, anything in her path. What profoundly troubled her was the fact that this included children, known to have been used by insurgents to slow down or stop military convoys and thus render them prey to ambush and massacre. I had to convince myself and my superiors, said Sally, I had to convince myself and my superiors that I could, or rather that I would, without any hesitation, accelerate and drive straight over a child in such a situation. She practiced just this in active simulation, rehearsing it over and over in her imagination and even in her sleep, until she was ready. As it happened, the situation never arose, so Sally never actually killed a child. Even so, she returned from Iraq desperately traumatized and consumed with shame. To help others further understand her inner pain, the depth of her soul wound, she explained that before her National Guard unit was deployed to Iraq, Sally had been a preschool teacher. It was what she wanted to do for the rest of her life. But how can a trained killer of children do that? It's her question, not mine. If we consider her confused, suffering from unreasonable guilt and shame, then it is we who are confused and who need to listen long and hard to the men and women whom we have trained and sent off to wage our wars. So sensitive, it seems, are the consciences and so vulnerable the characters of men and women that being trained to kill, and thus being prepared and ready to kill, can suffice to darken their souls. Living with moral injury is, after all, what traditional Christian moral theology called living in sin. In that tradition, sin lies in the will, in conscious intent, put simply in the heart, not in the act. To have been willing to kill is to have killed. Actions are one thing, and the intention or inward disposition that accompanies them is quite another. The former is what everyone sees, while the latter is what God alone sees, and it is what God sees that matters. It is not surprising that all of the armed services in my country have found it a steep challenge to accept the concept of moral injury, much less the implications of such acceptance. After all, what this demands is to confess that the profession of arms imperils the souls of those in military service. Military service, after all, is supposed to build character, not destroy it. As I have said and heard from too many veterans, they were told from the start that their service, they were told from the start of their service that they could suffer the loss of an organ or limb or even their life. But they were never told that they might well lose their soul. What's more, however difficult it has been for the armed forces to swallow the reality of moral injury, it has been every bit as difficult for the Catholic Church and nearly all Western Christian churches to question the traditional just war doctrine rooted in the writings of Ambrose, Augustine, and Aquinas, upheld in the face of innumerable savage conflicts across millennia and surviving intact in the age of thermonuclear arsenals. Just war theory is embedded in the curriculum of every military academy in the United States and in nearly every Western nation. Admittedly, just war was from the beginning supposed to mean limited war. This was the explicit intent of its founding fathers and erstwhile advocates. But intentions, as we have seen, are for God's eyes only. Everyone else is left to stare at and live with the consequences. and in this case, the consequences of Western Christianity's long affair with the god of war have overstepped every limit imaginable, save human extinction, which we have risked and to which we have come perilously close more than once. In short, just war theory promises war without sin, which is a fiction that drives men and women to take their own lives. The truth is that in my country, we are only in the very early stages of recognizing and understanding moral injury. To date, the Pentagon and its minions have only gone as far as to admit the existence of moral injury, because it is undeniable at this point. Still, for many, this remains a leap, a road too far. The military search for a cure may be described as desperate, whether in some form of preemptive inoculation or retroactive treatment, as if it were a coronavirus. Many millions of dollars and years of research have been squandered already, questing for the moral equivalent of a fountain of youth or a Men in Black neuralizer. The truth, quite obviously, is that non-violent conflict resolution and lasting peace are the only honest solution, as some ranking military officers have admitted to me, even ranking military officers in the Pentagon, in the Office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in fact, have admitted to me off the record. They said the armed forces and the defense industry wagging the dog cannot seem to stop themselves from dreaming of war without moral injury. War without moral injury. Business, in other words, as usual, with clear consciences for all. War without moral injury is for the rest of us, however, a nightmare from which we find ourselves powerless to awake. In the meantime, treating the morally wounded is the mission at hand. The good and bad news here is that moral injury is as old as human conflict, and so we can fruitfully look to the past as well as to the future for help. Ancient wisdom, rediscovered, can and often does turn out to be cutting edge. Most, if not all, traditional societies have developed and handed down their own rituals and therapies for reconciling enemies, cauterizing hatred, cleansing the pollution of fratricidal war, exorcising souls haunted by the souls of the dead, recovering lost humanity, and restoring the image of God in us. The theater of Dionysus in ancient Athens, the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus, Native American sweat lodges, and Roman Catholic confessionals are only a few among the countless sacred spaces sought out by the morally injured in search of healing. Added to these are an expanding number of contemporary therapeutic options, including equine-assisted therapy, adaptive disclosure, psychoanalytic dream therapy, wilderness retreats, pilgrimages to former battlegrounds, communal remembrance and mourning, art, poetry, storytelling, drama, and acts of restitution. For those neither experienced in war nor trained in one or other therapeutic science or art, deep, empathic listening without judgment is always a hand reached out in friendship and compassion. Jonathan Shea, a pioneer in understanding and treating moral injury, and a legend among countless American veterans, has emphasized one simple truth. Veterans heal veterans through communalization, listening to each other's stories, and embracing each other's pain and brokenness. I would add to this, and conclude with this today, the conclusion of Marine combat veteran and therapist Dr. David Alexander. It would seem, he writes, it would seem terrifyingly simplistic to say that love is the answer in aiding veterans. Veterans who have experienced a connection with or absorption of evil in combat that has contributed to such personal and relational devastation. And yet, he says, and yet that love is the answer is my very suggestion, with the caveat that loving veterans will certainly mean co-suffering. In my experience, he says, co-suffering is in fact a part of all our healing, as none of us can be healed from anything alone. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Bob. I mean, there's so much that comes up, but to finish with that last sentence, an invitation to courageous compassion for all of us. So thank you for leaving that with us. There's so much that we can go back to, and I'm sure that our respondents will, from our own position here in South Africa, will begin to respond to what you've said. But let's just take a break. I mean, I think there's a lot that Bob shared with us, and he went straight into deep water territory with his deep lived experience. And so let's just come up to the surface, take a bit of fresh air, go and have a coffee or tea, or we come back. It's now 5 to 4 on my clock. So let's take a 10-minute break. And we come back and we try and start again at 5 past 4. I wish we were physically together to have these more informal conversations where we get a chance to ask the questions we're sitting with. And I've spent so many hours with Bob, just like having these deep conversations where what stayed with me was that even though Bob clearly has a strong question, is quite pacifist position he's taking, but he's not anti-veteran. Like there's this deep compassion for the people who are fighting on behalf of us. And that unless I'm willing to give my life for non-pacifism or for pacifism, I cannot blame the individual soldiers, and I need to accompany them through this process. So that's one of the big lessons I've learned from Robert. But I'm conscious that we've asked 2 people just to do an initial response, and it's great to see there's people sitting with questions. And that we want, please put it on that form that we've created. We don't want to lose any of those questions, but in the limited time we have, let me just, without further ado, I mean, Willem, with your own experience also of having been a chaplain in the late 80s, and then many years of working pastory also with people within the Dutch Reformed Church, do you want to just share a few things? You don't have to use the 20 minutes. But just a few things that you might want to say as an initial response to what Robert shared with us.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, Donnie, thank you for inviting me to be the first person to respond. I don't know quite why you invited me or if I'm suited for the job, but at the same time, I feel a bit flattered, and I will do my best to make a contribution. I want to say a few things about myself as an introduction, because I agree with the acknowledged, distinguished German theologian Jürgen Moltmann that people not only listen to what you say, but they also listen to the person. They want to know who the person is who is talking. So I've been a full-time minister in the Dutch Reformed Church my whole career. I made my matric in 1979, and then I had to make the decision all the young boys of my generation had to make, and that was to either first go to the army or first to university. So I opted to go to the university first, and I was at the University of Pretoria for 7 years, from 1980 to 86. And after that, I did my national service. So it was 1987 and 88. Important was that I was not a 17-year-old when I joined the army, but I was 24 years old. I had 3 university degrees and a postgraduate diploma. And I was a married man, so that made quite a lot of difference. And the second thing is that I was not trained as a combat soldier. I was prepared, like all the others in my class, to serve as chaplains. So we did a short basic training, 2 months, and then another 2 months of leadership training. And the army was eager to get us deployed to the different bases as soon as possible, because they couldn't do the work of the chaplaincy without the national service men. So shortly after Easter of the year 1987, I started working as a chaplain in the South African Army with the rank of 2nd lieutenant, wearing the purple beret of the chaplaincy. Now, when I prepared for this conference, I realized that I can't rely on my own experiences only. So I engaged in a number of conversations with other people, with my peers, and it was sort of a wake-up call for myself, reopening some conversations that have died down over the years, because remember, the system of national service ended in the early 1990s. It's 30 years ago. And in 30 years, it collected a lot of dust, and it's not an open conversation anymore. But my first impression was that things are definitely not neatly sorted out and put to bed, so to speak, after 30 years. Now, our generation was trained to block things out. We were trained by the army to block things out. For example, when we wrote letters to our loved ones, we were not allowed to give any details about our whereabouts or who the commanders were, where we were, what we were doing, and so on. And we were warned that our letters were read and censored. And that is actually what happened. One individual, for example, who wrote jokingly that the army was much like a circus, equally many clowns, but many more tents, was kicked off his leadership course immediately because his letter was read like everyone else's letter. So in other words, the starting point, if you had a traumatic experience, the starting point was to block it out and not to talk to people you had confidence in about it. And in many cases, those things remain blocked out. But we know that to block things out, just move it to the subconscious and it will haunt you from there. And one person said to me, his wife to this day has to duck and dive sometimes in the middle of the night because he was still fighting his war in his nightmares. So I think this conference serves a purpose, just to blow some dust off the past 30 or more years, because those experiences live on in the hearts and minds and the spirits of men now 60 or 70 years old. To Robert, I just want to say that I find the concept of moral injury a very useful concept. And I accepted it as a useful concept, and as a theologian, my take on it is that it's the image of God that is heard in us, and I gladly work with that concept. Now, let me just hasten to say that not all our experiences were negative. There was much to enjoy, and it was an adventure And for many, it was a transition to manhood, leaving your mother's nest and coming into your own in a world of men. And nowadays, there are many reunions taking place. Anelia will be able to tell us more about that. 40-year and 50-year reunions of men who suffered together during their basic training or in combat, but as a result of that became lifelong friends and who wish to see their old buddies again after so many years. You were also somewhat of a hero. Not only your family, but sometimes the whole community went down to the train station to see off the boys going to report for national service. And the talk was how these boys were going to return as men. And when they returned, they were fit and they were strong. And the girls admired their toned muscles and their healthy tan skins. And they also always came to church in their uniforms, and the mothers were so proud. And there were often prayers for the men in uniform. In the circles where I grew up, there were no questions about the validity of our border war. Both the USSR and Communist China were very active in Africa at the time, expanding their spheres of influence. And that was the perceived threat. And that was what we were fighting against. We counted ourselves with a free world, and we were willing to defend that freedom. Now, the SA Army also did good work through their communication operations, for example. They set up clinics. Many doctors did their national service working in remote clinics. Teachers in uniform helped out where in rural schools where there were not enough teachers. Many agricultural projects were set up and supported and so on. So my first point is just that not all the experiences were negative, of course not. And then I just want to pause for a moment and broaden the scope of this conference. In Afrikaans, the conference was advertised as diensplig, die bagasie van 'n generasie. Klink mooi, né? But I would like to add 3 and maybe 4 groups to the group of national servicemen. The first is the professionals in uniform who chose a career in uniform. And when I did a research for a PhD, they were identified as the group that suffered most, the most intense personal losses. Many had to cut short their careers. Many individuals who had a proud and a decorated career find themselves in spaces where their careers are demonized. And people say, how could you? So many of these individuals live with emotional and spiritual scars because of what they've done, what their colleagues have done, because of their training in warfare, because of the gruesome scenes that they've witnessed over the years, because of the constant danger and the constant fear that they had to live in. The second group is the children and other family of men and women in uniform. Because children identified, other family members identified with the battles their parents fought. The third group, and I have to add this item because we talk about moral injury and strategies to possibly heal and help with moral injury. And that is the dilemma in present day South Africa, the high incidence of violent crime. Allow me a minute to explain. In crime statistics, South Africa rates 3rd in the world, behind Venezuela and Papua New Guinea only. In 2021, we recorded 76.86 crime incidences per 100,000 of the population, plus minus 25,000 murders in 1 year. That's 68 per day. Your chance is 1 in 3,000 to be murdered in South Africa today. Add to that almost as many attempted murders. The statistic for assault with the intent to inflict grievous bodily harm is in the order of 180,000 cases per year. Your chance is 1 in 350 to be attacked and assaulted in a serious way. Now, how do good people react and live their lives in a society like that? The police and the state security systems have failed us. So what do people do? They take personal responsibility for their personal safety. I know of many people who are armed all day, every day. And I find that story of Sally very helpful, Robert. She never killed. But in the same way, many civilian people in South Africa today have taken the same decision as that convoy driver, that if it's necessary, they will pull a trigger and they will kill to defend their own lives and their loved ones. They will shoot and they will shoot to kill. And they've taken that decision and they've rehearsed that in their minds. They're morally injured too. Now, politicians often talk about the war on crime, and it is a war fought not only by the police, but by civilians and by civil institutions. So we must include basically the whole population of South Africa as morally injured because of the incidents of violent crime. And then lastly, maybe with the tongue in the cheek, as an afterthought, I also have a question about the very realistic computer war games. In order to win these games, you have to kill off the enemy. I know it's a virtual reality, but I still think the question needs to be asked. Don't players condition themselves to kill? But I leave it with that. But if we acknowledge that there are more groups of people than the national servicemen of the 1960s to 1990s. So let's get back to the national servicemen and the baggage they still carry. Many talk about the fact that they still react to certain impulses. One friend tells me his daughter laughs at him every time that he jerks with fright like this. Even today, when he hears a sound that reminds him of a landmine explosion, because it was his task as a national serviceman to sweep rural farm roads in the Limpopo Valley, where there were quite a few farmers killed by landmines at the time. Others react instinctively to sounds of sirens, sounds of dogs barking, the smell of blood, the smell of gunfire, or images related to images of the enemy or of the battlefield of 30 or 40 years ago. Now in the USA, there's been a constant stream of war movies that shows you how the community is haunted by the Vietnam experiences. Now, not many movies are made in South Africa, but many books were published the last 30 to 40 years about the border war. Some are serious and soul-searching. Some are books full of jokes and funny stories. Some full of bitterness and others light-hearted. Another clue that things are not sorted out: in the very recent past, the remains of fallen soldiers were dug out in southern Angola and reburied in South Africa. A relative of mine was deeply involved with that. And it was a deeply emotional process for the families involved. And then expeditions of retired soldiers were reported widely in the newspapers. Old or retired soldiers that visited old skirmishes sites in Namibia and Angola and met with the local people decades after the war ended to get closure for themselves. There's no doubt in my mind that there's a lot of unfinished business. Now, just a little bit more about my own involvement. As a chaplain, Chris, I agree with you. The chaplains were part of the system, and especially the young national service chaplains. But our first task was to preach the gospel. And I was privileged to have a senior chaplain who was very clear about that our first task was to preach the good news of salvation through Jesus Christ. But we also did our little bit to legitimize our war and paint the picture of a good and a just war. Now, I was not aware at the time that the Iron Curtain was about to be dismantled and that the old school communism was about to collapse and therefore not be a threat to us any longer. The Berlin Wall fell just after I completed my national service, and I had no clue that it was coming. It came as a complete surprise, and I also didn't understand the significance of that happening. I talked to people the last couple of weeks who said that they had no sympathy whatsoever with a dead terrorist. They didn't see in him the image of God, and there was no remorse. There was actually celebration. And I had no clue. As a chaplain, I had no clue, and I was not prepared at all to deal with that kind of moral injury. And I think the most healing came from veterans or soldiers comforting soldiers, often with the help of enough brandy and coke. That was the only help that many of them had. Now, I did my border service not on the northern border of Southwest Africa at the time, but on the Mozambique border, a small strip between the Kruger National Park and the north of Swaziland. But that border was secured by an electric fence and patrolled by the South African Army. Now, I never witnessed killing, but I saw the bodies of underfed Mozambicans under that fence, because that electric fence was lethal. The people who died there were not the enemy. Now, there were so-called guides who had a thriving business of helping Mozambican people cross the border illegally, just a few kilometers from the border post. And during all dark, overcast nights or during new moon, there were always illegal crossings, either by cutting trees and letting it fall on the fence, or by creating a tunnel underneath and lifting the wires with forked sticks. And from the troops, I heard the stories of Mozambican mothers with babies on their backs who outsprinted the young soldiers to freedom and to food and to job opportunities on our side of the border. Unfortunately, I had, even though I was only 24 years old, I had the opportunity to raise the question about that lethal electric fence at the General's Order Group. But I want to conclude and just suggest a few possible ways to treat or heal moral injury. And being a minister, my first line of thinking is actually maybe the only place that I expect help from is from the church. There's no other body or place that my generation can turn to for help. And when I say the church, I'm not thinking, sorry to say that, Donnie, the church in all its important meetings and the synods, but the local church. I want to suggest and just quickly name 6 possible ways to help. The first one is by leadership, by a sensitive leadership that has the courage to reopen a conversation of long ago and to lead congregation in a collective mourning process of our collective war burdens. And Robert, I agree with you that the guilt and the shame and is not only those who participated in the war, but it is a community, it's a collective burden. Then the second is our worship services, to deliberately use moments of confession of guilt and sin in our worship services. Now, a worship service is a safe space, and there are very few such safe spaces. It's been called a holding environment. You can allow yourself to be dependent, to be vulnerable, to be weak in that space. There are not many other spaces where you can deal with the darkness, the evil, the confusion, the bewilderment within yourself. In a worship service, you can dare to trust God and trust your brothers and sisters in faith with your inner secrets. And I spoke to people this week who told the stories how they found healing and how they found peace in conversation with God, being reconciled with God, accepting His forgiveness, and who found peace in that. The third one is related to that is church music. And I want to quote Professor Hamann from Princeton University, asked the question, how can you have liturgical integrity if your music does not speak to the sorrow and uncertainty your gospel community is experiencing? We need music that can carry disappointment, grief, tears, disillusionment. The fourth one is to make much use of the biblical lament. Start with the book of Lamentations, and then also the large number of laments in the Psalter. We need the raw and real emotions, the politically incorrect and the theological incorrect utterances. It will help us to be more honest. It can help us with the vocabulary of loss and sadness and grief. Fifth one, pastoral care. And in my book, pastoral care is done not by the professionals, but by the congregation, by each and every believer. Everyone cares for everyone. Leaders can set the example to engage in honest conversations, reopening forgotten conversations, hopefully push through to life-giving conversations. And Robert said where it starts, by listening long and hard to what is on people's minds. And then the last one, sixth one, is rituals. And I just want to, we must be creative on this, but I just want to say something about Holy Communion, because it speaks of sorrow, it speaks of blood and wounds and death. We need to find new ways to make a real connection between our wounds and the wounds of the Lord. Ways to find healing through His wounds. The God that we worship didn't shy away from insults and pain and agony and blood and death. He's the man of sorrows, acquainted, familiar with suffering. But I will conclude with that. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Sure. Thank you very much, Willem. I could see in the body language of people listening how people were leaning in and nodding heads. So Anelia, I could see also you really resonating with some of what Willem was saying. So without further ado, because I think there's a richness in what you bring and what you share. Thank you so much, Willem, also for talking to other people and bringing some of those voices into this space for us also to hear the often very uncomfortable things that we've not dealt with, especially as a church. So thank you. Anelia, please, from a different generation, different gender, different place in the world, but with a passion for the deep healing that we all are searching for, also as fellow disciples of exactly the undomesticated Christ that Willem has spoken about. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you, Wilhelm, for putting all of this together and inviting me. And wow, Willem, I recounted just another interview, basically. So much of what you've said sounds familiar to me. And I was moved again by the grief and the intentional grief that you're going through when you recount your story. Before I begin, I would like to issue a short trigger warning, but I'm really glad that we are all white here and we are all older. So I might say some things that are racist and politically incorrect, but it's in this safe space where we can listen to our honest pain. And I just want to give you a short warning on that. So when Professor Verwoerd asked me to be here, I kind of wondered to myself, why would a woman in her 30s with no background in journalism or history or in the church suddenly become so interested in talking to a bunch of crazy, racist, bosbevolkte old men? And I must begin with a ritual. So Dienstplig is really the product of lockdown boredom and frustration. So at the height of the pandemic, I was unable to travel home. And when the travel restrictions kicked in, I was shocked at how untethered I felt in my new adopted home in Germany. I also have to say that I unfortunately picked up my accent in Australia. So I am born and bred South African, but if it is somehow annoying that you hear an Aussie twang, I apologize for that as well. And like Willem just said, we are a nation scarred by violence. And I was struck by the fact that even with all the elements that white people back home dream of, I mean, safety, job security, being surrounded by mostly white people, I did not see a future for myself in South Africa, anywhere else, but in South Africa. And I questioned where this weird patriotism came from. And at the time, my grandfather passed away and a funeral was impossible. And I searched for rituals that could help me not only grieve the sense of the loss of our patriarch, but also the loss of community structures that help us make sense of loss. I was grieving the loss of a family member, but I realized I was also culturally bereft. And this kickstarted a project where I collected spoken word eulogies and compiled them into a podcast. And after hearing of other migrant families who are going through the same problem, who are unable to say goodbye to their loved ones, I decided to launch this as a service. And through my audio memorial business, I met someone who identified himself as an army man, and I'm really happy that he is with us today, Yuan. And after I crafted this audio memorial for his mother, he mentioned that the format itself was this protective veil against judgment and fear. And it was similar to when veterans start to talk about their trauma after they've had some brandy and cokes and they're sitting along the beside the campfire. And we got talking, and he told me that people will be willing to talk to me if I was willing to truly listen. And I interviewed him, he referred me to a few other veterans, and through social media, I started collecting stories through interviews. And I launched dienstplig.org as a repository for stories of all angles. And when I got pushback from the media, that's almost what really got me going. There's a famous Fidel Castro quote about the border war where he says, "It's a nice story. What a shame nobody has written about it fully." But that isn't necessarily true today. I think, Wilhelm, when you touched on the fact that there's border literature, there's a new wave of border literature since the early 2000s. a bunch of history books written from below, your own book included. And I'm really grateful for that. I'm grateful that veterans can talk amongst themselves, but Yuan, my client, was the first person who was willing to talk about his experience so openly to me. And 55 interviews later, I realized that unbeknownst to me, I grew up in a community of veterans. I was born in 91, so basically when Willem's Dienstplicht stopped, or when it was over, and also 1 year after Namibia gained independence, this whole country for who this war was fought. I was completely oblivious that I was surrounded by ex-combatants and soldiers. To me, they were just teachers, coaches, business managers, church leaders, my father, uncles, and all the other ooms in my community. And I mean, you mentioned that there's a strong aversion to talk about the past. And I think its roots are almost in the fact that all conscripts had to sign the secrecy declaration in line with the Defense Force Act. And as one combatant explained it to me, you had to be all clear by the psychiatrist, the army psychiatrist, to leave the army. So not talking about your pain was the only way you could go on with your life. And only through listening to their stories, I realized how much their moral injuries have shaped my upbringing in both and good way, in both bad and good ways, because they don't necessarily manifest themselves in PTSD the way we see in the movies. I mean, the American culture has done a really good way of telling us what PTSD looks like. To me, it looks like militarized sports coaching at school. It looks like homophobia. It's a banal hatred towards Black men. It's a deep shame towards Black women. And it's an aversion to talk about mental health in any way. But it's also an appreciation for nature, a resilience and discipline as a virtue, and this maybe fraught sense of duty towards my country. And I always find it really interesting that the Afrikaans word Dienstplicht is not as passive as the English word for conscription. And it's not as violent even as the German word, which is Wehrpflicht, which is duty to fight. And I think almost the sense of duty is what's ingrained in us as children as well. When you talk to veterans as well, there's almost always disagreement about who is entitled to trauma. It was a very long conflict. So many people struggle to agree who's entitled to trauma. Is it those who fought experienced military professionals in Angola? Is it those who did township duty? Is it those that were queer and had a hard time adjusting? That's why when I interview veterans, I don't focus on the technicalities or on the morality of the Angolan border war or the conflict at home, but as Dienstplicht, as a common denominator of a generation. And Dienstplicht starts with basic training. So for us, Robert, just some background. When you explain Sally's training, this is something similar. And in the SADF, this was reduced to 12 weeks. And even those people who had a really good time in the army, who tell me it's the best time of my life that I don't want to relive, or the Afrikaans, they say, "Is die beste tyd van my lewe wat ek nooit weer wil hoor hê nie," would tell me that basic training is hell. And these 12 weeks aim to simulate war. And if you want to compare war to hell, I would always almost try and describe basic training as a passage to hell, and rituals in this passage to hell include receiving your force number, shaving your hair, getting a uniform, and partaking in a series of senseless exercises called an opfok. I'm sorry, Robert, but it's literally called to be fucked up, to break you down and to build you back up again. So when I asked the captain what the outcome of basic training should be, he explained it that at the end of 12 weeks, someone who has gone through basic training should be a soldier. And a soldier is a person who is not only able, but also willing to direct a weapon on a person or object and shoot when ordered to do so. And when I heard this, I was suddenly feeling really hurt, because I realized that even my most loving, gentle father, for whom objection to conscription was never a viable option, was reduced to a soldier. And when I asked him about his dienstplig, he simply answered, "Ach, it was stupid." Yet, when we don't talk about the past, and the subject has indeed gathered quite some dust over the past 30 years, the present becomes increasingly painful. And I'm almost keen to quote someone who heard of this symposium, a chaplain who was invited to join us today. He said, "This American ideology of moral injury is irrelevant to us. It would be much more helpful if the church helped us to deal with the incompetence of the current ANC government." And I think this is very important to listen to this, because when I ask ex-conscripts what it was like the day they received their force number when they turned 16, one person, instead of telling me that it was this celebratory ritual to manhood, he said, "Well, in those days, the post office was still functional, so I received my force number in the mail." And another question I ask ex-combatants is if there's anything that sometimes trigger a stress response today. And without fail, more than one person said, "Oh, it's the smell of diesel. So whenever there's load shedding and a generator starts up, I'm back at the base in Oos-Kaapland, and I'm also reminded of the smell of decomposing human flesh." My final question sometime in some of my interviews is to explain who the enemy was. And here the answers get extremely muddled. And that's also when they start stuttering. And for me, it's almost testament that many of them were too young to vote, but they were old enough to shoot a gun at the time. And once they start explaining, it was the Russians, it was the Cubans, it was the Swart Gevaar, so basically communism, but also a fight against Black liberation. When I think long and hard about this, it's actually the ANC. They have deep respect for Russian and Cuban veterans, but to them, the ANC remains a terrorist organization, and it obviously hampers their willingness and ability to be contributing members of society. And it leaves them feeling frustrated and irrelevant. And with each failure of the state, this idea is reinforced. And with that, also the original mandate with which the apartheid state sent these young men to war, which was not only a fight against communism, but a fight against communism and to help Black people protect them against themselves. And one veteran summed it up perfectly. He said, "I was called," and I'm apologizing again for very crude language here. He said, "I was called a kafferboetie at school because I was against racial segregation. But when I look at how they run the country now, I wonder to myself if I should have fought a bit longer and tried a bit harder. We're dying out now, so who's funding these socialist ideals?" And I think when we really try and listen to what this ex-combatant is trying to say, it's not that he's glorifying apartheid. He is grieving for something that he has professed a sin. And to me, that is the exact moment where transitional justice can take place, and where also healing from moral injury can take place. Apartheid for me as a young child, as a born free, was always morally indefensible. But when I listen to the stories of our elders, I think I'm starting to realize that they were just trying to be good soldiers in what at the time was a just war. And I think for many, we have to tell them that it was a just war at the time, and that is okay. It's okay to feel shame that after the fact they realized that it was never a just war, and war is irrelevant. It's never just. And Willem, you touched on a few rituals, and I would like to say that young people are here to help. I mean, the church is old and it has lost its relevance increasingly in society. And I think my podcast, or what I'm trying to do, is just one such ritual. And I would recommend that if you do have these rituals, there's a wonderful safe space of intergenerational ignorance. I mean, I'm a grown woman, but when I interview these veterans, I'm always meisikant. Meisikant, let me tell you something. Meisikant, Robert, is the Afrikaans for young lady or girl. So there's this weird father-daughter dialogue happening. And I think in that space, it creates a sense where we can really listen to each other. And it's also a space for intraracial reconciliation. It's painful for me to hear how racist my fathers are and how racist white men are, but it's important to listen to it before we try and do reconciliation on a broader perspective in South Africa. And I think intergenerational storytelling can really pave the way to a broader reconciliation in South Africa. And I like to end with a quote from my favorite ex-combatant in this project. He said, "Daar's baie meer storieetjies as wat daar bloed was in hierdie verhaal." There's much more stories than there are blood in this war. So thanks.
Oh, thank you, Anelia. Can you just add something that I was hoping you would say, but I was very touched when we discussed beforehand, when you said, what is some of your, when you respond, when somebody intergenerationally shares that story, you said sometimes you respond in a way which for me was very moving.
Oh, in some cases I would ask them, so what happened? And then they would say, oh, there was a fight, or there was an incident, there was trouble. So lots of euphemisms are used to explain certain situations. And when I asked them to go deeper, I'm like, I don't really understand what the Afrikaans word is contact, contact with the enemy. And then they would start saying, oh, but that's when you shoot people. That's when you kill. And then they take a moment and then they say, yeah, that was bad. And then we agree. In that small moment in an interview, I can help them say, that was tough, that was bad. And that's admitting, I think, to injury, is that moment where they have to describe what happened to them. And it's not just ex-combatant, it's also people saying how basic training, for instance, really scarred them, like things they've seen, people they've seen hurt. Their feeling of frustration in the current society, I think, is also an admittance of moral injury. And not to judge them for that, but just literally to concur with them, to say, yes, that is tough. I'm not going to correct your statement. I'm just going to listen.
And then sometimes you have said, I'm sorry that that's what you had to experience, isn't that?
Yeah, I do. And I also tell them, I'm sorry that that happened to you. And we are not here to judge. As children, we are definitely not there to judge. We don't know what it was like. So who are we to judge?
Sorry, I mean, for me, that was that there's this healing of this kind of empathetic, compassionate, but even using the language. I'm sorry that that's what you have from you as somebody embodying the next generation. There's something there to explore. Okay, so there's so many rich thoughts, ideas, possibilities. There's already a few connections that you've started to make with what Robert shared. Obviously also highlighting some of the differences. Both Willem and Anelia, you've done that. But I think we probably, again, just need a short break just to stretch our legs a bit, just to let things sink in a bit. When we come back in 10 minutes, we're going to go into smaller groups of just 4 people at a time, just to give us a bit of time to interact with each other, to begin to make sense and respond to what we've heard. And then we're going to open it up to the larger group, to any questions you might have that you want to ask Robert, or you want to ask Willem or Anelia, and we can just see what comes to the fore, and just sit with if it's a comment, try and keep it short perhaps, but let's see what comes up after the break, and trust that the Spirit will guide us in this deep healing work that we are doing together. So thank you so far. Let's take a 10-minute break again, 5:05. See you then, and then we continue. Thank you. Went by very quickly, but I mean, in our small group, we were only 3, but it was such a rich, there's so much that came up there. So I trust that it happened in the other small groups too. I almost want to just say, let's trust the Spirit of the man of sorrows, the Spirit of the feminine healing as well. There's definitely a gender dimension here. There's an intergenerational, there's so much going on in this journey. And of course, the church, the Dutch Reformed Church in particular, is also implicated. There's so much to this, but I don't want to steer the conversation. Let's hear from, I just want to almost let's give a few people a chance to make a contribution, perhaps ask a question. If you just want to say something, I'm asking you just to keep it short, because I know many of you will be able to share so much with us. And we ask that you do that afterwards, and that you share your resources with us. But for an initial comment, perhaps just try and keep it short. And if you have a question, perhaps directed to Robert in particular, but also to Anelia or Willem or the group, let's just take a few comments and questions, and then see where that takes us. If you put up your hand, I hope I can see. I might not be able to see everybody. Let me just see. So just use the function where you put up your hand, please, for me to see if you want to say something. If you want to share something from the small group with permission.
Mag ek gou inval hierso? Dis Johan.
Johan, yes, please. If possible, you can speak in English, then Robert can follow us as well.
I just want to put the following on the table. I'll just explain it. We must remember the levels of the war. We had a conventional war between us and the Cubans, Russians, and the Angolan government. We had the guerrilla war in which we supported UNITA against the Angolan government. Then we had the counterinsurgency war, which we fought against SWAPO or PLAN. And then we had a low-intensity civil war inside South Africa. And in terms of the conversation we're having, as a soldier, depending on which level you were, especially when you got involved in the what I call low-intensity civil war in South Africa, in the townships, the Lucasis, you constantly had to adjust your moral compass. In a conventional war, you have a very defined enemy. And as you move down the levels, the enemy becomes blurred until you had this situation inside South Africa, where the same guy that works at the filling station putting fuel into your car might be the guy throwing the petrol bomb towards your armed vehicle that night. And that aspect of the whole conflict became a huge burden for me, not in terms of the enemy, but in terms of the innocent that got caught up in the middle of this conflagration, which did not affect us in the white suburbs, but the maid in your house came from that into your normality, and that didn't always work for me. Thanks. That's all I wanted to.
Thank you, Johan. It's a crucial, like, to sketch the complexity. And what we hear from many people is that the township-based or the local-based work was often morally the most challenging and emotionally. Anybody else that wants to? Hannah and then Anton. So just let's go in that order. You're muted. You're muted.
I was just so struck with the with the whole notion of the moral injury, that you didn't necessarily have to kill somebody to be morally injured. And what I'm thinking about is the fact that there's a whole generation then. If you're following on from Anelia's explanation of the basic training, there's a whole generation of men who were morally injured, but probably many of them too young to actually understand that they've been morally injured. But then sitting with this unresolved, unconscious, unowned repulsiveness within themselves, something that cannot be named, that cannot be spoken about. And one wonders what happens to those, to that, and what happens in terms of projections into society, particularly if you think about the violence in South Africa, you know, because, yeah, it can't just stay inside people. It has to go somewhere. That energy. So I'm wondering about the correlation, really, you know, as Anelia and Kobus also said in their reply.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anna. Anton?
I want to add to Anna. We talked about maybe two lines of moral injury. The one is the trauma line. You experienced some stuff and you did some stuff and everything that we talked about this afternoon about. And the second line is what Anna referred to now, is that you were part of a subculture, and there were language and rituals and things that maybe is harmful today in many areas, like racism, sexism, homophobia, emotions, low EQ, cowboys don't cry, problems with grief during the COVID time, people don't know how to grieve. Affirmative action came, and the same crowd of people. I was an 18-year-old in 1985. I received my calling there in the northern parts of Namibia. And so my generation was also maybe mostly the victim of affirmative action. And that language about racism and all the stuff that I named now, and affirmative action, it formed one whole for us. So the enemy became the old enemy again. And the rhetoric and the words we use was all part of that toxic culture that came back. And not to judge because we are children of our time, and we didn't realize exactly what went on, like Hannah just said now, and a few other people also this afternoon. And we asked in our group, but what can we do? And so we said, maybe we must try to help people to deconstruct it. That there's a lot of challenges, and normally, like the Israelites in the desert, they fight with Moses, and actually God wants to tell them something, and to deconstruct and help people to find out what did they learn, what must they confess. If they feel guilty, they have to confess it, but the things that happen now is new challenges. It's not the same enemy. If my children is naughty, I'm not angry with all the children in the world. And I know it's not easy, but try to hear the stories, deconstruct it, take it apart. It's not one puzzle. It's different chapters in your life. Yeah, that's a short, in the 10 minutes, that is what we came to. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just wondering, I mean, there doesn't seem to be any urgent hands up. But I mean, Robert, you've been listening to us, and I think one of the gifts that you bring is that you come with a different set of eyes and a different set of ears to this conversation. And I just wonder, is there something that perhaps jumps out at you as an initial impression, perhaps a question you want to pose, or just an initial comment or response to the responses or to some of the comments you've heard? And then we'll go to Karel after that.
Well, there were a couple of things, Wilhelm. First, I've been very convinced, more and more convinced over the years, of the extent to which I spoke of it as the contagiousness of moral injury, the way that it is handed on from generation to generation, because I've probably come to know, I won't say work with, just come to know the families, the wives, the siblings, the children of the veterans whom I've come to know. I've come to know their relations and their children and so on as just as well. And one of these women told me once that, well, first of all, she described her very, not violently dysfunctional, but her basically dysfunctional family, and the latent anger, the frustration, the distance, the chill in the house, the silence in the house, and so on, as she was growing up and entering adulthood. And she said that that suddenly one day she read a book. I mean, she had been reading a book, and there was a line in the book that just leapt out at her, and she said it just shed so much light on her life and what she had known. And it was a book written by a young woman, Danielle Trussoni, and it's called Falling into the Earth. But this is Danielle Trussoni's own story about her relationship with her father. And her father was a tunnel rat in Vietnam. No one was assigned to that duty in Vietnam. You had to volunteer because it meant nearly certain death. These were usually people of short stature, because they had to go down into deep, long tunnels, which were very often booby-trapped, and confront the Vietnamese who would be in those tunnels, waging war from the tunnels. It was a whole tunnel network, and this was all throughout South Vietnam. Anyway, the life expectancy was a month or two in those, and he survived. Her dad survived, and he volunteered for it. He survived. He came back from the war. Eventually, his family, his parents broke up, but she remained. She was the only member of the family who remained very, very close and committed to her father. And even at the age of 11, she said that, or she writes how she began to accompany him, to sit next to him in bars. She would drink her ginger ale or whatever they would given her, and he would drink. And she just was loyal to him. And this remained all throughout her childhood. She went off to college, and in her 3rd or 4th year in college, she was sitting, this time she was drinking a beer or whatever, along with his mixed drinks that he drank. And anyway, she said, you know, you always berated your fellow veterans who couldn't get on with their lives, who were in one way or another disabled by their war. You went on, you had a career, family life was problematic, we both know, but you went on with your life, and you always berated those who just dwelled with it and allowed it to haunt them and so on. So she said, what did you do with your war? And he said, well, I gave my war to you. And suddenly her life was intelligible to her. She realized, yes, he had handed down his war to her, and that's just a truism among veterans and their families.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. And I think there was a strong intergenerational dynamic, obviously with Anelia, but also in the small group that I was in. I don't know if the people involved want to share some of that, but Karel, your hand was up. Please feel free to contribute.
Robert made a comment now, and that's a comment that is worried me a lot. You see, moral injured people, I think moral injured people cannot heal other people. And now we have a problem, I think, that the moral injured grandfathers cannot be example for their grandchildren. And I think we have some kind of a problem to the 3rd and the 4th generation, as the Bible tells us, that we have a situation now that we have children now in this land of us, and they have moral injured grandfathers. The problem, I think, is bigger than only the veterans of the war. I think the problem is now a problem that we raise moral injured children. I only want to make that comment.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, I mean, there's much more we can say about that. I don't know, Anelia or Willem, like in terms of what you've heard so far, if you want to make any quick, I think what I was hoping that we could perhaps do this and then spend the last 15 minutes or so specifically asking for people who have found rituals or processes that they have found healing and they found helpful, which was very prominent in our small group. So I want us to also just leave some time for us to share that amongst each other, because I think this is so important to understand the depth and the intergenerational transmission of these issues we are struggling with. But we also want to encourage each other to do what we can to respond. So Anelia and Willem, I don't know if you have an initial comment or something you want to add.
Absolutely. Yuan really quickly and in such a concise manner captured to me what this conflict was all about. And as a white person, we cannot talk about the border war without talking about race, and to dig really deep into the hurt of racism, because this is manifesting in our children. And I mean, apartheid never ended, it was just privatized. And I think when we talk about the border war and when we talk about our veterans, we need to revisit when was the first experience where you realized you were racist? That's a question I picked up in one of the workshops with white work. And as a child, I remembered that our maid and our person working in our yard had a different set of cutlery and plates. And I would have to take their lunch to them. They were never allowed to sit at the table with us. And this is just one way it's manifesting. This conflict has manifested into daily life, and that this conflict was also about apartheid. And this was a really helpful question I would ask my generation was, when was the first time, your first memory of being a racist? And that was a really good introspective question to ask.
Thank you, Anelia. We're opening up huge areas here that I think we need to spend more time to unpack what you've just said, but just an initial comment or something you want to add, Willem, and then I would love us to shift gears a little bit and say, let's share from our small groups, perhaps some of the things that we have found hope-giving, encouraging for us. Willem, which you also started to do obviously towards the end of your input, but is there something else you might want to add now?
Yeah, thank you, Willem. I would like to suggest all of us associated with the church that we accept the work of intentional grief as a permanent and a hard work as a normal part of our ministry. There's so much grief, so much loss, so much hurt, so much trauma, so much shame, guilt, whatever. It's realities in all our congregations and in all our communities. And my take on that is, if the church is not going to do that, no one else is equipped or ready, or no one else is going to do it. And our society and our communities are not going to heal in any other way than by an intentional, by doing intentional grief work on a permanent basis.
Thank you. Thank you. That's pointing us perhaps in the direction which I want to suggest. We spend our last 10, 15 minutes perhaps just sharing with each other what are some of these key lessons we've learned in working with these morally injured issues, or whatever language we find ourselves comfortable with, the kind of deep healing work that needs to be done. Let's just see what, I'm tempted to ask people from my small group, but I don't want to put you on the spot. Thank you, Andre. I really hoped you would share some of what you shared in the small group. Andre has a video limited for Wi-Fi, so we don't have the video, but the voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilhelm. Just like I explained in a small group, I sat here with two hats. I'm a chaplain working in a healthcare society, so I work a lot with nurses, medical personnel, especially on the topic of moral injury. And then also another hat, I'm the current national chairman of the largest veteran organization in Namibia. So we have been over the last few years very much involved in the whole thing of how do we address this whole trauma and everything. And one of the things, just as an idea, firstly, yes, we spoke about it, we must create safe spaces. That's the first thing. So what we started to do is we call it storytelling evenings. We invite somebody to tell his or her story. And I found that whole storytelling situations as a really healing process. And then also we've got this informal social events that, yes, typical South Africans amongst the fire, we started talking about our war stories. But interesting, we call it a shallow. We've got two unwritten rules. That the first rule is that we never promote hate. If you start promoting the hate language, you will be taken out of the situation. And also that we never glorify war. And I've seen, and the first few times that we had these rules, there was a bit of uncomfortableness, but now it's so wonderful stories that people start to realize my story counts. Even if I just a national conscript doing transport work, my story counts, and I've got a story to tell. And then also very important that we turn these situations also into family situations where younger generation, because there's a misconception that the younger generation don't care about these things. They really want to understand what happens, not to criticize. I shared a story with them of a paratrooper veteran that we have in our group. He was involved in one of the biggest conflict contacts over the border, Kasinga raid. And he told the story, and this family at that moment were not involved in the process because of confidentiality. And his son at that stage was 9 years old. And finally, after he told that story to the group, his boy came to him, he was now a grown man, and said to him, "Thank you, Dad, for now, for the first time, I really understand why you were not at home for so long." So that healing process, and again, I think we from the church must also admit, especially Dust Reformed Church, that we created more moral problems for these veterans, because the same church that they fought under and promote apartheid and that now all of a sudden denounce it. So I found this among the veterans, especially in Namibia, there's a lot of these people that were starting to distance themselves, especially from the Dust Reformed Church. So there's a lot of healing. And another thing, quickly before I end, there's also, we had a lot of conversations and events that we invite from the former enemy, the Plan veterans. And that's another very, very possible tool and positive tool to also create this whole healing process. Because if I hear my enemy's story, I also can understand my story much better. So yeah, just a few ideas from our side on this side of the border. I think we also on this side has got a bit of different experience, because our South African veterans and from the Territory Force veterans are not considered veterans in this country. So we also are still being seen as the enemy by politicians. But on the veteran level, we are really making huge steps in this community. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Andre. I was asking Andre whether any of this has been recorded, has been captured in ways that we can share some of that learning. I know that I see Rolf Skuman is here. I've read his work. I know there's other people who've been doing this work, but I think it would be wonderful if we can figure out a way to share some of these learnings that people like Andre, when you were sitting there, there's so much. And you also shared something about facilitating the journeys of people who want to go and visit the sites, the kind of these return journeys, that you also facilitate that, and how healing the kind of journey process can be for some families. Anybody else perhaps along the same lines? Melanie, yes, please.
Yeah, actually just like a phrase. When we speak about the intergenerational healing, maybe, yeah, it's just to break the cycle of moral injury contagiousness to heal the system. And then we can be like a society who has whole hearts again, and fathers who can speak to their children and to their grandchildren, and children who actually understands where their fathers come from. So break the cycle to heal the system. Thanks for the opportunity.
Can I ask you, I mean, you shared something, if I may, but with the importance of emotions in this whole process. And I just thought that was such a key insight.
Yes. I'm very triggered by the emotions of people, and I think, yeah, okay. This is my view, but the people who did dienstplig, were trained not to speak. So obviously they were trained to hide their emotions or not speak about it, and maybe their hearts got hardened in this process, and that is contagious. And the way they are fathers and treat their children, or that has an impact on the whole family setting as well. So you have to learn to speak about your emotions to break this cycle, but you weren't taught it at home. So yeah, these emotions they are sitting with, they can't go anywhere, they're trapped in their bodies, but they have to speak about it. So the storytelling is yeah, a really good way. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks, Melanie. There's 3 hands. Our time is limited. So yeah, please, Rolf, Kobus, I see there's somebody from a younger generation there as well. It looks to me, if I'm not mistaken. And then Francois, let's just hear your inputs briefly, if possible.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. I just want to keep it short. I want to add on what was said already about storytelling. And especially, you know, what I've experienced is really helping us to find the dignity and also the humanity of the other person is storytelling with your former enemies. And there's a lot of healing taking place. And in that regard, I'm very excited about what's happening with Father Lapsley on the healing of memory workshops that's actually taking place. We've been involved in many of these workshops last year, and it was very, very wonderful in that sense of speaking to the enemies. And then the other thing is social engagement. You know, what we've experienced in the South African Defence Force Association is to get the veterans to speak and to open up. And what we've realized is to get them into smaller groups and social engagement, you know, like playing golf together, like doing stuff together, and then we break down all these barriers and help them to open up. So I just want to add this, and I think in that sense, it will be wonderful if we could have also the support of churches in helping us, you know, all the different Defence Force Associations in creating safe spaces where people can have social engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Rolf. Please, if you have anything, any resource, anything that you find helpful, put it on that Google form so that we can gather this, so that we can see who's doing what. I mean, so Rolf, please, I mean, I know you've published it. I know there's probably websites, healing of memories. Just put those things for us in a way that we can capture some of this, so we can then see what can be done further. Kobus, if I'm not mistaken, you look a bit younger, so I'm looking forward to your contribution.
Don't look forward too much, Wilhelm. But yeah, just one comment. I think that what Willem said, one of the things he said that was that everyone who has pictured himself defending his family and making the decision that I will shoot to kill if needs be, is also implicated. And I think that helps me when I'm planning in our congregation to start that conversation, to know that I'm also implicated. I'm not an innocent bystander looking on to some injured people, some old guys who have done something wrong. And I think that's where Jesus's divine wisdom comes in, when he said on the sermon, in the Sermon on the Mount, that when I just think about when I call my brother an idiot, then I'm also implicated. And I think that just helps me with that conversation that I want to facilitate.
Oh, thank you, Kobus. Francois.
Willem, jy mag Robert vertaal nadat my Engels het opgeraak, soos my airtime. Weet jy, ek wil graag net hoor die Anelia die bonafide verklaar van dat ons groepering wat vandag gesels is ons nou wit groepering. Ek sal graag wil hoor wat word daar gedoen by 'n VGK, by 'n bruin en 'n swart gemeenskap om hulle ook te help om daardie opleiding wat gekry is in die jare van apartheid en kontoisiso en al hierdie dinge, wat word daar gedoen om daardie mense ook te help by die verwerking van onafgehandelde emosies en geweld? Ja, so dit is maar net my vraag. Ek sal graag weet, is daar hulp ook vir so iets?
Thank you, Francois. The question, Bob, was just, there's the Uniting Reformed Church, which is comprised of what we call Black and colored South Africans from those racialized backgrounds. And the question was really, what about the militarization, the people who were involved in the conflicts in the past? What is being done within those churches as well, which is part of the bigger challenge for the Dutch Reformed Church to become more unified, or at least to interact also with our sister churches. So that's just to pose a question. I mean, if anybody has suggestions or know of things that are happening, I think for me, that was Andre's very helpful point. And what Rolf also then sort of stressed was that I think there is something about what Jesus again said, we have to love our enemies. There's something in that with veterans and people who are involved in conflict that I think can teach the rest of the society that we can work through our differences and we can find our dignity as brothers and sisters in Christ, or at least as children of God. Knowing that for many people, religion has become associated with ideology and the church, like telling them to go and fight, and then they don't want to go near institutional religion. But I think we need to find these ways to use the wisdom from our Christian tradition and to use the churches to also, do that work. But I think the important thing that I've learned in the last few years is that sometimes within the white community, and even within the Afrikaans-speaking white community, and even within the Dutch Reformed Church Afrikaans-speaking white community, we need to create unique enough spaces that people can feel free to be real and honest with each other, to work through things, to open up things, not to be judged, not to worry about being seen as racist or whatever, that we have spaces to work it through so that we are a bit better equipped or a bit more prepared to go for the love of our enemy commandment, which is the most difficult one in the Bible, of course. So I hope that also this intra-group, this kind of working amongst each other, we're speaking English tonight also because we want to remind ourselves that there's an international human story that Bob really was giving to us, not only in terms of America, but going back into the classics, going back into the just war theory. I mean, these are thousands of years of people grappling with war. If you read the Hebrew Bible, I mean, it's full of war. If you think of Jesus, it was in the midst of empire and war. It's all in the Bible, and we can draw on that. You can see I'm now starting to get carried away by the things that I'm also passionate about. But is there anybody, perhaps, I mean, we're coming really to the end of our time. We don't want to keep you longer. Please, if you have comments, or even if there are things that was said today that you were unhappy with or that you disagree with, but also if you have suggestions about the way forward, let's try. I mean, we're not promising any concrete next steps at this stage, but at least to know and to hopefully find energy to work with this intergenerationally for the sake of I think discipleship, taking up our cross as we believe. Is there anybody that just feels like they really don't want to miss this opportunity to say something or to contribute something, knowing that this is just once? And then I'll just give the last word to our three respondents to just briefly perhaps say something at the end. Is there somebody who don't like? Are we okay to move into final comments? Okay, so there's the space to share comments, evaluate. Yeah, please evaluate also in the forms. We would really greatly appreciate that. Let's just go from where we were, like we asked Anelia perhaps to just say something, and then Willem, and then Robert, just as a final comment or contribution you want to share with the group.
Absolutely. I don't want to really comment. I want to ask Wilhelm, when as a child, I grew up with Tekkie Kerk, Tekkie Kerk, so more informal. Tekkie Kerk, right? So when is the first brandewyn and coke aand by die NG Kerk? Because I think that's what we really need.
Thank you, Anelia. Willem?
Ja, brandewyn en coke het sy rol gespeel, né? I just want to thank Donnie for the initiative. It was really a wake-up call for myself, and I think we, as a community and as a church, we need to take up this challenge. I'm really convinced if the church and more specifically the Dutch Reformed Church doesn't do it, no one else is going to do it. This is on our table now. It's been dusted off a bit, and yeah, just for myself, I've been motivated to do something more and to get the people. There's lots of people hurting, and lots of people of my generation and a bit older and a bit younger who can really benefit from new conversations, reopen conversations. So Donnie, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Bob? I know it's difficult to make a brief comment, but if you can.
Just 2 points. First of all, with Jonathan Shea, who is not a religious man, after all, he's the origin of the term moral injury. He has pointed over and over to what he refers to as his Bible, and that's the book of Judith Herman called Trauma and Recovery. And for her, there are 3 stages of recovery. The first is sobriety, safety, and self-care. The second, constructing a personal narrative and grieving and sharing that narrative and sharing that grief. And the third is reconnecting with people, communities, ideals, one's own ideals and ambitions. And I think turning, to those, we have kind of a path. We have definitely a path to recovery that we can assist others and ourselves engage in, because we're all of us, I think, tainted and darkened by moral injury. The other short point I would make, even shorter point I would make, is that every ancient society has had rituals of return and recovery from war, communal rituals not only involving those who went to war, but those on whose behalf others went to war. And we don't have those. We have parades, which all of the veterans I know are ashamed and angered by parades. We need other rituals, and we need rituals that involve not just marching, ex-combatants and current combatants, but also the entire community. Because when we send others off to war, we go to war. And when they bring their war home, it is our war, and we find it in our bedrooms, we find it in our streets, we find it in our schools. We have to find those rituals. For some, it will be religious rituals. For others, it may not be. But on this level, any ritual that addresses the suffering of our fellow human beings, I see as religious rituals.
Sure. Thank you, Bob. That was profound. Thank you, Donnie. I mean, it feels right just for you. Perhaps you started us off. I mean, if you want to just perhaps make a closing comment, I'm not going to ask you to say a prayer. That would be a bit too much. But just it feels right for you, perhaps, to close our session. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, no, Wilhelm, thank you very much for your skilled leadership this afternoon. And I really want to thank Robert and Willem and Anelia for their input. I point you once again to our little page on the web, where we have various resources. And as we spoke this afternoon, I added a few resources there, and also the notes of Professor Meagher. And then I've asked Willem for his notes, and Anelia has got her blog, her podcast already. So we are adding a few resources there. Please use that. And I want to thank everyone for your participation. So may God really bless you. Amen.